You want to turn in your Bibles to the book of 2 Chronicles. Chapter 20 is where we'll be studying. I heard a sermon recently by Brother Wayne Jackson, and it kind of intrigued me thinking about this passage and this prayer of Jehoshaphat. Brother Jimmy and I were talking recently about some ideas or an idea for a potential summer series this upcoming year, 2025. And I don't think I remembered to tell you this, Jimmy, but I have written down in my just summer series notes where I just sometimes almost scribble, scratch. I just rough ideas out, but I have an idea, and I was thinking about this again because of this lesson I'm looking at tonight, that might be a good summer series idea, or at least a series idea of prayers that are recorded in Scripture. Different prayers that are recorded. Sometimes we have prayers of Jesus recorded. Sometimes we have prayers of others recorded, and lessons that we can learn from those. And again, this one in 2 Chronicles 20 is quite interesting, and there's a lot that we can learn from this prayer of a man named Jehoshaphat. So again, we'll look at this in 2 Chronicles 20. But first, I want to get a historical background so we understand where we are a little bit in the history. Obviously, we can't give everything, but some high points, if you will, to understand where we are in the time period. God creates all mankind in the beginning, and you have Adam and Eve, the first male, first female, and all humans are descended from them. Of course, wasn't terribly long after the earth and all that in it, including humans, were created, that God determined, because of the wickedness of man, to destroy humanity via a worldwide global flood. 8 people on the ark were spared, Noah and his family. From there, they began to disperse. God called Abraham to follow him. Abraham was not perfect, but he was faithful to the Lord. He finally has a son. No doubt he thought that would never happen. He was promised by God, even though he was past, he and his wife both were past the age of having children. They were going to have a son. So Isaac was born. Then Isaac, of course, has a son, 2 sons actually, Esau and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. They are the 12 patriarchs, and from Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, he who prevails with God, all the Israelites descended through Jacob and his sons. When the book of Genesis closes out, you have there in the later years of Jacob, in the later years of his life, he and the rest of Joseph's family, remember Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brethren. God providentially protects him. Joseph ends up second in command in Egypt. And things were going okay, but he tells his family there's a famine coming. It's going to be severe. It's going to be a long time, 7 years. And so they relocate to Egypt, Jacob and the other family members of Joseph. So all the Israelites at that time, much smaller in number, they relocated, they moved to Egypt. But of course, even though things were great for them when Genesis closes, there arises another king. He doesn't know Joseph. And in fact, he sees Israel multiplying and he says, it's just a matter of time. Just a matter of time before some enemy attacks us, and they're just going to join our enemies and fight against us. And so he decides, I need to enslave them. So that's what he does. He enslaves Israel. They cry out to God. God remembers his promise to Abraham to give Abraham's descendants the land, the promised land. And so God sends Moses. 40 years past when Moses thought it should be and thought it would be. Moses has gone off. He's married. He has a child. He's wandering. I don't know if I'd say wandering in the wilderness, but he's in the wilderness, taking care of his father-in-law's sheep. Sees that burning bush. It's burning. It's on fire, but it's not being consumed. He goes to check it out, and God speaks to him and says, Moses, now's the time. You're going to go to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. And now all of a sudden Moses is kind of like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And And he has those excuses, of course, but he does. He goes, leads them out. God brings Egypt to their knees through 10 plagues. And primarily that 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh just says, get out. But even then, he hardened his heart, chased him to the Red Sea. God parted the Red Sea. Israel crosses on dry land. The Egyptians are drowned. Moses leads them to Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, where they are for about a year, they received the law of Moses. They received the 10 Commandments written on the tablets of stone, but don't forget, there's a lot more to the law of Moses than just those 10 Commandments. But they did receive the law there at Mount Sinai. Now they leave Mount Sinai and they should have gone right to the Promised Land, of course. But at Kadesh Barnea, they send out Moses, per God's instructions, sends out 12 spies to go and check out the land. They come back, they say it's great, it's everything God has said, it's everything we've been told. Oh, but there is one little problem. We can't take this land. Not a chance. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. They will crush us, they will defeat us. We don't stand a chance. 2 of those spies, Joshua and Caleb, they say, oh, no, we can. Yeah, there are giants in that land. There are powerful people, powerful inhabitants, but we can take that land because God has told us we can. He's going to be with us, and he will deliver them into our hand. But the people didn't listen, right? And so they listened to the 10 unfaithful spies. And because of that, because of their lack of faith in the promise of God, God sentenced them 40 years in the wilderness, wandering, till that generation died out, that unbelieving generation, except for those 2 faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb. Now they reached the edge of the Promised Land after 40 years of wandering. Moses, he's not going to enter in because of a breach of faith on his part. He on one occasion there was one occasion where he was told to strike a rock. But on this particular occasion, in Numbers 20, he was told to speak to a rock. He's angry, he's frustrated. Israel's complaining again, but he gets, we might say he kind of lost his temper a little bit, and hear now, you rebels, and he strikes the rock. And so God says, because you didn't believe me, to sanctify me in the eyes of the people, you and Aaron, who also was involved in that incident, you're not going to enter the Promised Land. So they get to the very edge, the very cusp of the Promised Land. Moses dies there on Mount Nebo, buried, nobody knows where, only God knows. God buried him himself. Joshua succeeds Moses as Israel's leader. Now, Joshua's going to lead that conquest, and he did. And God told them very specifically, even going back to Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, the repeating of the law for that new generation, you drive out those inhabitants utterly. You destroy them completely. And as we've said before, it's not because God has a problem with other ethnicities or other races or other countries. It's because they were idolatrous. This was a judgment from God. But the problem is they did not do that. The people did not utterly destroy the inhabitants as they should have. And so those inhabitants, and God tells them very plainly in the very early parts of the book of Judges, in fact, he warned them against this in Deuteronomy, if you don't obey and drive them out utterly and destroy them utterly, they will be a thorn in your side. You know how they were. Because during the period of the Judges, some 350 years or so, you have this recurring cycle where the people sin. And because of their sin, they are oppressed by some of those people that were in the land, some of those inhabitants that they didn't drive out. And they would suffer, and when it got to the point where they had suffered enough, they would realize, hey, we're lying in the bed that we've made for ourselves. And so they would cry out to God, God, please help us. We're in this mess because we've fallen prey to worshiping idols. We've apostatized from you. Please help us. And God would send them a champion. And I don't remember who it was that I heard years ago. It may have been Papa that was teaching and said one time, you might be better off to think of the judges as for a better term to describe them instead of thinking judges, because we sometimes think of a judge, sitting in a courtroom and they're going to judge matters. And judges did that to some extent, but these judges were champions. And their number one job was to inflict casualties upon the enemies of God. And that's what they did. And so God would send, when the people cried out and turned back to him, God sends a champion. And this champion is going to take it to the enemies of God's people, and they'll deliver them. Having delivered them, now they enjoy a period of peace. And then you know what happens? It's just a matter of time, and that cycle starts all over again. And you just see it continually in the book of Judges. That's the cycle. Israel later is going to demand a king. There were some 14 or 15 judges. Sometimes we say 15. Abimelech was, he sort of made himself a king. He wasn't, picked out by God in the same way that some of the other judges were. So I'm almost hesitant to call him a judge, but nevertheless, 14 or 15 judges. And when Samuel is older, the people say to Samuel, "You're getting old, Samuel. And we've noticed something. Your sons, they don't walk so faithfully after the Lord like you do." And their solution is not, "We want you to rule longer. We want you to bring your children into line, work on them, discipline them," whatever. Their solution is, "Give us a king." And that's what they really wanted all along. And you see that because they didn't ask for some other action to be taken. They jumped from that to, "Give us a king." And you know why? They said to give us a king to be like the other nations around us. So they want a king. I put there, they demanded a king. I don't, that may be a bit strong, but they certainly didn't really put it in the form of a question, did they? Give us a king. Make us a king. Well, then you had, of course, Saul, David, Solomon, the United Kingdom. The kingdom was united under them. We sometimes call that the United Kingdom. They each ruled for 40 years. Saul did not stay as humble and subservient to God as he had been when he was originally chosen. So God says, "I've chosen me a man after my own heart, David." David was not perfect, but he had a heart that sought God. And God says to David wanted to build God a house. Remember 2 Samuel 7? And God says, "I'm going to build you a house, David. And your descendants are going to sit on the throne." And he even goes so far as to say, "Your descendant," plural, or singular rather, "is going to sit on your throne." And that's ultimately a prophecy referring to Jesus. But after Solomon dies, Rehoboam, his son, makes a very foolish choice. Some of this was due to Solomon's sins, and God told Solomon there would be consequences to his sins because Solomon married foreign wives who turned his heart away. Seems to be good evidence that he turned back to God toward the end of his life before he died, but nevertheless, there were consequences. And so Rehoboam, his son, was foolish. He listened to the young men instead of listening to the wiser counsel of the older men. He upset a lot of the folks from the north who were saying, make things lighter on us, lighten the tax burden, don't be so hard on us like your father was. He says, "Oh, I'm going to make my father's hip look like my pinky will be bigger than my father's hip." In other words, he's saying, "You ain't seen nothing yet." And so the kingdom divided. Up in the north, you've got Israel. In the south, you have Judah. Israel's first king was Jeroboam. And even Jeroboam, God promised, "You follow me, I'll establish your kingdom for generations to come." But Jeroboam didn't do that. He went and set up an idolatrous worship in the northern kingdom. But in the south, you have Judah. In the north, you have 19 kings. In the south, you had 19 kings plus one usurper who set herself up as queen, but she wasn't a descendant of David, or wasn't a chosen descendant of David. In the north, of those 19 kings, not a single one was faithful to the Lord. Now, in the south, you had a few that were. Not all, but some were. Some were evil. In fact, some, like old Manasseh, says he outdid the heathen. He was so bad. And then some were kind of, as I put it, so-so, in between. Sometimes you have some like Manasseh who were horribly wicked, and then later in life he repents. Now, he'd put the nation on a path that there was no turning from, but he repented later in his life. You have some that were pretty good early on, like Asa, and then later on in life they turn away and are cruel. and godless. But there's your divided kingdom. Jehoshaphat ruled in the south, in Judah. He is king number 4 in this line of kings of Judah. Now, it is also important to get some background here in the sense of Jehoshaphat's reign. I'll go ahead and mention this. The Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites, they have formed a confederacy against Jehoshaphat and Judah. But the Moabites and the Ammonites are descendants of Lot. Lot and his family, they flee the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is Genesis 19. And listen, don't you ever think that even though you might still be faithful to the Lord, and Lot was when he lived in Sodom. In fact, the Bible tells us that in 2 Peter that Lot, his righteous soul was vexed. He stayed faithful. And so we need to be careful, because sometimes people will talk about, when we sometimes talk about pitching tents toward Sodom, and then eventually you end up in the city and you end up being influenced by it. And sometimes people, I've read sermon outlines and things like that where people are like really hard on Lot. The Bible does say, by inspiration in the New Testament, he stayed faithful. That's why he was spared. But when he comes out fleeing that destruction, they were told, don't you look back. Number 1 casualty was Mrs. Lot, who looked back, right? And she turns into a pillar of salt. But the effects of Sodom, the influence of Sodom did not end there, because he flees and he ends up in this remote mountainous area, and his daughters decide, we're the last people on earth. We have got to propagate the human race. And so they get their father drunk. And they have this incestuous relationship with him. And from that, older daughter, younger daughter, you have the Moabites and the Ammonites. And that's where those people come from. They're kind of almost like, we might call them something similar to cousins to the Israelites. And then, of course, the Edomites are descendants of Esau. Esau being the twin brother of Jacob. And boy, they had their issues, didn't they? I mean, you think sometimes we have drama in our families. It's not new. Jacob and Esau, they had their drama. Jacob stealing the birthright, deceiving his father with his mother's help even. And he goes off and he comes home and he's scared to death of what is his brother going to do? How's he going to react? And what he ends up finding is Esau forgives him. I mean, he just welcomes him with open arms. And they sort of, literally and figuratively, they hug it out. And they make their peace. But what's ironic about that is their descendants never did. They never liked each other, Edomites and Israelites. These 3 nations have come together against Jehoshaphat. They all 3 live somewhere either east of Jordan or in the southern area, and they've formed this confederacy, and that has prompted Jehoshaphat's prayer. But thinking in terms of his reign, if you want to look at all the details, and we're summarizing here obviously, but you can look at 1 Kings 22, 2 Kings chapter 3 deals with his confederacy, his alliance with Jehoram, king of the north. But the main text would be 1 Kings 22 and especially 2 Chronicles chapters 17 through 20. He began to reign around the age of 25 years of age, reigned for 35 years. Now, back up just a little bit to 2 Chronicles, and we can see a lot of times inspiration will give us kind of a quick summary of a king. Was he good? Was he bad? Was he somewhere in between? What is God's assessment here? And you see it in chapter 17, verses 3 and 4. And the Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the first ways of his father David and sought not unto Balaam, but sought to the Lord God of his father and walked in his commandments and not, this is key, not after the doings of Israel. That's key because the doings of Israel go all the way back to Jeroboam I, who established that idolatrous golden calf worship, and he would appoint priests of anybody who wanted to be a priest. He changed the time of God's Passover feast. He changed so many different specific things that God had given them instruction about, and he just throws it out and does what he wants to do. And so many times it's said throughout Scripture of a king in the north, he walked in the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. Jehoshaphat did not do that, and that is significant. This is also significant because do you know who is reigning in the north at this time? A fella named Ahab. And if you know even probably a cursory knowledge of Old Testament history, you know Ahab was anything but a good, righteous fellow. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find many people much worse. Oh, but there is one glaring person that stands out as worse, right? And that would be his spouse, Jezebel. And buddy, they were an ungodly, wicked duo, if ever there were one. But back to Jehoshaphat. He was a reformer. He was dedicated to the law of Moses. He was even evangelistic. He's going to send people into the northern kingdom that has to teach them. For the most part, the northern kingdom has apostatized. They've got this golden calf worship. But he sends Levites. He sends people up there to teach them the law of Moses and to preach to them. He's sending missionaries out, essentially. You can read about his later reforms in chapter 19, 4 through 11. But like all humans, there's a typo there. It's supposed to be like all humans. He was not perfect. His reign, it was one of the most prosperous times economically speaking. But you know, and I know that prosperity often breeds complacency, weakness, and so it was with Judah. And so he's got this three things that stand out. This unholy alliance with Ahab. You can read about that in chapter 18 of this same book. Also in 1 Kings 22:44, of course, Ahab's wife Jezebel, as I mentioned. But they went to battle against the counsel of God. Ahab was killed in this battle. Jehoshaphat was spared. Jehoshaphat was rebuked by the prophet Jehu for this foolish action. In fact, you can go to chapter 19 of 2 Chronicles, verses 1 and 2, and Jehu just says it very plainly. Shouldest thou help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? Therefore is wrath upon thee from the Lord. Nevertheless, there are good things found in thee, in that thou hast taken away the groves out of the land and hast prepared thine heart to seek God. So, this unholy alliance with Ahab, but you know, it didn't stop there, unfortunately. And this is one of those I've mentioned before about the article that Papaw, Brother Roger, my father-in-law, has written. Jehoshaphat, what are you doing? This is one of those moments where you just left scratching your head. What is he doing? What is he thinking? Doesn't just make this alliance with Ahab, because he ends up giving his son, or taking for his son as wife, Athaliah. Athaliah becomes the bride for his boy, Jehoram. Well, what's the big deal about that, Chad? What's the problem with Athaliah? Oh, I'm glad you asked, because she was the daughter of said Ahab and Jezebel. Now, there's an old saying that I used to hear sometimes growing up. If you marry a child of the devil, expect to have problems with your in-laws. If you take for your child a child of the devil, expect for your family to have problems from your in-laws. Athaliah, not part of our study tonight, but later on, her son, Ahaziah, is going to be killed, and she is going to, great-grandmother that she is, go and kill her grandchildren and proceed to place herself on the throne as queen. And she would have killed the line completely. But of course, God has a promise to keep, and so Joash was spared. He was hidden by a nurse. But that's the kind of people you're dealing with here. If anybody could rival Jezebel in wickedness, it might be Athaliah. I mean, you folks have grandchildren. Can you imagine a grandparent rising up and just slaying all of their grandchildren. That's Athaliah. There was another unholy alliance with Ahaziah, king of the north. See that in 2 Chronicles, latter part of chapter 20. Also 1 Kings 22. And then an unholy alliance that I mentioned a moment ago with Jehoram, the son of Ahab. But we want to get to Jehoshaphat's prayer here in chapter 20. And just notice three aspects of this prayer. It's not a lengthy prayer at all. It begins in verse 6. You've got Jehoshaphat. These people, they come and they tell him there's a multitude coming against you. Verse 2. He feared. He set himself to seek the Lord. Verse 3. Proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. But he stood in the congregation of Judah and Jerusalem, verse 5, in the house of the Lord before the new court, and said, here begins the prayer. Notice, first of all, his reverence for God. So he says, O Lord God of our fathers, art not thou God in heaven? And rulest not thou over all the kingdoms of the heathen? And in thine hand is there not power and might, so that none is able to withstand thee? Here again, you see his reverence for God. Look, these are not questions that he's asking God. Oh, are you the Almighty God? No, they're not interrogative questions. They are confident assertions of the true universal sovereignty of the one true God of heaven. And you know, it's kind of like in Daniel chapter 2 where Daniel mentions there that God changes the times and the seasons. I believe it's, I was trying to remember if it's Daniel or Nebuchadnezzar speaking there. But anyways, he changes the times and the seasons, Jehovah does. He removes kings. He sets up kings. Gives wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. Daniel 4:17 in the context of Nebuchadnezzar having his kingdom taken away for a time. Daniel says, you're going to find out, Nebuchadnezzar, and you're going to lose your kingdom until you come to know and understand the Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will. Well, Jehoshaphat here, he confidently asserts God's sovereignty. And his great reverence, his great respect for God is seen throughout this prayer. But you see it here in the beginning. He comes before God and he says, we recognize you as the all-powerful creator, the all-powerful, the one true living God. You see his reverence. But you also have this, we could call it a rehearsal of God's past acts. Going into verse 7. Art not thou our God, who didst drive out the inhabitants of this land before thy people Israel, and gavest it to the seed of Abraham thy friend forever? And they dwelt therein, and have built thee a sanctuary therein for thy name, saying, notice here that God is called, or Abraham rather, is called the friend of God. And I think about that, and I think about, am I God's friend? Is God my friend? James talks about in James 4:4, friendship with the world is enmity with God. Whosoever be the friend of the world is the enemy of God. I want God to be my friend. Abraham was a friend with God not because he was sinless, because he wasn't, but he was a friend of God because he walked with God. And so it's also interesting here that this is present tense in the sense of Abraham is God's friend. Remember Jesus' argument in Matthew 22, making the argument for the existence of the resurrection, the fact of the resurrection, because God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, they're still alive. We don't cease to exist when we leave this life. But here Jehoshaphat thinks on some specific things, past acts of God, and he thinks about and iterates things that God has done for Israel in the past. Look, he's not trying to sit here and lecture God. He's not trying to say, oh God, I guess you've forgotten about this, so let me remind you. No, he knows better than that. But what he's sitting and doing is, we might even use the term musing on some of the past blessings. And here's where I think there's an interesting a thing for us to think about in our prayer lives. How often do we, again, as I often say, I can only speak for myself, but sometimes we rush to make requests. Nothing wrong with those requests, but we're sometimes rushing to make a request for this moment in time. Maybe there's a sickness, maybe there's been an accident or something like that, and we're thinking about those things. But here, Jehoshaphat, before he gets to the matter at hand, he goes back. Well, I mean, way back. And I was thinking about that, have you ever just stopped and thought, maybe you weren't a Christian years ago. You had reached adulthood. You weren't a Christian. You ever stop and just say, God, I remember years ago when that person came to my door and they knocked on my door. And then, lo and behold, I ended up in a Bible study with them, and I learned the truth, and I learned that I was not following the truth, even as I thought I was at the time. And Lord, I'm so grateful you sent that person to my door. Or maybe, God, you sent that man, that woman into my life. And he, she, and whichever the case may be, taught me the gospel. Or helped me to come to know the gospel. Just think about those things from the past. I don't remember what it was, but it's been some time ago. But I think I was in bed one night just kind of saying my nightly prayers. And I'm like a lot of folks, sometimes you just fall asleep saying those prayers at night. But I remember at one point thinking, something just made me think about when I had ruptured a disc in my back years ago, back in like late 2003, and suffered with that most of 2004 before I was able to get something done about it. And I just sat there and I was saying my prayers, and I said, God, I'm so thankful. I don't know if I've said anything about that in years, but I'm so thankful for that surgery. I'm thankful that it went as well as it did. I'm thankful that for the relative, I've had some times when my back would bother me from time to time, but nothing that I could even be rightly tempted to complain about since then. And I'm so thankful for that because, God, I was miserable. That was terrible when I was suffering with that. Thank you so much. Again, thinking in terms of spouses, when I moved away from Illinois and came down back down south, back to Alabama, and was going to school, I was miserable. I didn't like that. I was thinking to myself, I have made a horrible mistake. And I don't even know what I was going to do with my life or do with myself. And, lo and behold, I go speak at this youth lectureship in North Georgia, and I meet this Campbell girl. And we started talking a little bit and emailing back and forth a little bit, and wasn't that long before we started seeing one another and seeing one another a lot. And then next thing you know, we're married. And I sometimes stop and think, boy, God, I thought I just made the biggest mistake of my life, and I might have made the best decision of my life. Jehoshaphat just goes back through some past acts of God, and he says, God, you've been so good to us. And God, we don't always see the big picture, but you know what you're doing. And it's almost like he's just kind of exasperated, just like, I don't have the words. Take some time when you're saying your prayers to thank God for his past care, for his past blessings. What I try to do sometimes is to say, thank you, God, for the day that Don Blackwell called me and said, there's a church in Georgia that's looking for a preacher. And I know these brethren, and I'm familiar with them, and Chad, you need to talk to them. And I kind of put that aside a little bit, and then one day I'm talking to Frank Chester, and Frank says, Chad, you need to call those brethren. You need to call them yesterday. Okay, Frank, I'll call them at least and talk to them. And then talking to Don, and Don says, Chad, I think they've made a decision. They got it down to 2 or 3 guys. I think you probably have waited a little too long. And I'm thankful that I decided to reach out to Brother Leroy. And Brother Leroy said, They ain't hired anybody, Chad. It ain't over. He said, call them. And I think he made a phone call maybe to Chris or Jimmy or maybe all three, him and Chris and Jimmy and Martin. But I ended up coming to Bremen. And sometimes I just stop and thank God and say, thank you for your providence that brought me here 12 and a half years ago. And many times I mention people in the congregation here by name. I'm thankful for your encouragement, for your friendship, for your, as iron sharpening iron, helping me to grow throughout the years. But you see Jehoshaphat's rehearsal of the past acts of God. And then he rests in the promise of God. Look at verse 9. If, when evil cometh upon us as the sword, judgment or pestilence or famine, we stand before this house and in thy presence, for thy name is in this house, and cry unto thee in our affliction, then thou wilt hear and help. He's going to rest in the promise that God will hear and he will help. He's confident that Israel's going to stand before God's house. I think it's the English Standard Version that says, stand firm before God's house. Take a stand, in other words. And he's confident in God's faithfulness to hear them and to answer the prayer. Do you and I have that same determination of we will stand, as the American Standard 1901 puts it? We will stand. And you know, we're going to face hard times, and in 12 and a half years, we have. We've lost some folks. We've lost some to that old enemy, the last enemy to be destroyed, death. We've lost some to that old enemy, the serpent, the deceiver, the slanderer, Satan. Folks that have turned their backs and walked away. There'll be loss, there'll be hardships, there'll be difficult times, there'll be sickness. But are we going to determine, no matter what others do, I'm going to stand. I'm going to stand before God's house. That's not a physical edifice. That is the household of God, the church of the living God. 1 Timothy chapter 3. That's God's house. And so if my prayer is going to have power, I've got to rest in the promises of God. I've got to have this same kind of faith. We talked about that this morning from James 1, 6 through 8. Let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, not like a wave of the sea. The double-minded man's unstable in all his ways. Let not that man think he shall receive anything of the Lord. I've got to have faith that God will answer. Look, he may not answer how I want. He may not answer as I anticipated. But I can stand in the assurance that he will answer, and however he answers it will be for my ultimate good. It will be in my best interest. And Jehoshaphat knows that. And so he says in his request for deliverance, and that's the last part of this, 10 through 12, and now, behold, the children of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir, whom thou wouldest not let Israel invade when they came out of the land of Egypt, but they turned from them and destroyed them not. These were not good, righteous nations, these three people, by the way. Why did God not let Israel attack them? We don't know exactly why, but he told them not to attack them. And so he says, verse 11, behold, I say how they reward us to come to cast us out of thy possession, which thou hast given us to inherit. This is the thanks they give us, Lord. Then he says, behold, I say, verse 12, O our God, wilt thou not judge them? For we have no might against this great company that cometh against us, neither know we what to do. But I love this. I love this phrase. Our eyes are upon thee. He says, God, all eyes are on you right now because we're in over our heads here. So he requests deliverance. He recalls that God prevented them from attacking these very people, and this is the thanks they get, so to speak. He says, God, we're helpless. We're dependent upon you to judge us, to judge for us. God's going to go on through the prophet Jehaziel, and he's going to answer the prayer. verses 14 and 15, and he's going to say, I'm going to deliver you. In fact, it's kind of interesting because sort of to paraphrase, well, what God's going to do is he's going to cause the men of Mount Seir, the Edomites, to fight against the Moabites and the Ammonites. And then once the Moabites and Ammonites have combined to destroy the Edomites, now the Moabites and Ammonites turn on each other and they destroy each other. And so it's like, to sort of paraphrase it, God says, this is not going to be your battle. It's going to be my battle. So Jehoshaphat, Judah, just take a seat over here and you can watch, but I'm going to do this. I got this. He requests for deliverance, and God answers his prayer. It's such a beautiful prayer. It's not very long, but I don't know about you, but I learned something studying this, and that reverence in prayer, that's always something that we need to keep in mind. But trusting in the promises of God to answer our prayer, however it might be, knowing that he'll answer it for our good. But what really jumped out at me and stood out at me in this is that rehearsal of God's past acts, and thinking sometimes, from time to time, just stopping to think about God's past actions for our good. And just take a moment sometimes to thank God for that before I jump into whatever request I have in the present moment. There's so much more we could say about this. I think as we kind of close our thoughts out that there are a few just brief lessons we take from this. Even the best of men, they make mistakes. They're not perfect. Look, we can all relate to Jehoshaphat. He loved God, but he was not perfect. We talked about those alliances that he made, and those were mistakes. But even in spite of that, God assessed him as a good man, a good king. With our own strengths, our own weaknesses, we can relate to that. I think we can all relate to that. But look, we need to be working on those weaknesses, trying to eliminate them. Sometimes people use that almost like as an excuse. Well, we all make mistakes, as if we're all kind of in the same boat. Well, in one sense we are, but make no mistake, folks, there's a difference in somebody who makes mistakes and they're trying to work on it. They're striving to follow God versus those who don't care about it. They just sort of say, well, everybody makes mistakes. Even the best men are not perfect. And we also need to we need to follow God's counsel, his help. Even in those unholy alliances, you know what Jehoshaphat was always saying? Let's seek the will of God. Let's seek counsel from the Lord. Seek counsel from God and follow it. And then here's a lesson that I think we can take with us throughout our lives. There are times in life, you're just in a problem, you're in a situation, you say, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to turn. I don't know what to do. Give it to God. Maybe even pray the very words, English translation of words that we have here of Jehoshaphat. Our eyes, O God, are upon you. I'm looking to you, God. Look, sometimes you're going to face a situation in life, and the solution is make better choices. Make good choices, and maybe even put action with that. There's an old saying, if you're sitting on a tack, why fuss about it? Get off. Remove the tack. Can you imagine if I'm sitting on a thumbtack and I'm praying to God, oh, Lord, there's this pain in my rear. Please remove it, God. Well, that'd be silly. Get up and remove the tack. Sometimes I need to do something. Maybe tonight you need to obey the gospel. Maybe you need to come back to the Lord. Maybe there's something you need to take care of in your life that you can take care of. But there are going to be times in our lives when we get in a situation like Jehoshaphat and Judah, and we say, God, I can't handle this. I can't do this. There's nothing I can do. I can't take away that cancer. I can't bring that loved one back. I can't fix this situation. But our eyes are on you, God, with the understanding, the assurance, the trust. However you answer, it'll be in our best interest. Pray that prayer, live that prayer, and you'll be better for it. And ultimately, we follow him faithfully, we'll have that home in heaven. Maybe you're in that situation where there's something you need to do, better choices, action. We stand ready and willing to help you with that, and however we whatever way we can. Let's trust in God and let's go home with Him to glory when this life is over. Can we help you with that? If so, come while we stand and sing to encourage you.